1958, a classified Air Force document lands on a Pentagon desk marked Eyes Only. The title, A Study of Lunar Research Flights. The mission? Detonate a nuclear weapon on the surface of the moon, not to mine it, not to explore it, to blow it up, on purpose, in front of the entire world. This was a real program. It had a real code name. It had real funding, real scientists, and a real chain of command that ran straight to the top of the United States military establishment, and it remained classified for nearly 40 years. The project was called A119, and if everything had gone according to plan, the most visible object in the night sky would have carried a permanent scar, visible to the naked eye, as a message to every human being on Earth about who owned space. Then someone asked a question nobody had thought to ask, and the whole thing quietly died. But A119 was just the beginning. To understand why the United States military wanted to nuke the moon, you have to understand what October 4th, 1957 did to the American psyche. That was the day the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a 184-pound metal sphere, broadcasting a radio signal that anyone with a shortwave receiver could hear, beeping, calmly, over American soil. The reaction in Washington was not calm. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead into orbit. If they could reach space, they could control space. And if they controlled space, they could control the planet. Within months, the United States Air Force had commissioned a series of classified studies on how to respond. Not diplomatically, militarily. The thinking went like this: space was going to be the high ground of the next war, and whoever controlled the high ground always won. The Air Force turned to a physicist named Leonard Rifle, a man who had worked at the Armor Research Foundation in Chicago, a man who knew exactly what nuclear weapons could do at extreme altitude. Rifle assembled a team. The team included a young graduate student named Carl Sagan. Yes, that Carl Sagan. Project A119 began in 1958. The mission parameters were specific. The Air Force wanted to know whether a nuclear detonation on the lunar surface could be seen from Earth. Not just detected, seen, with the naked eye. The answer Rifle's team calculated was yes, under the right conditions, detonating the weapon at the terminator line, the boundary between the moon's light and dark side. The resulting explosion and debris cloud would be visible from Earth as a brief but unmistakable flash. The selected weapon was a W-25 warhead, small by nuclear standards, approximately 1.7 kilotons, delivered by an interstage ballistic missile launched from Earth. The technical challenges were significant but not insurmountable. Trajectory calculations, detonation timing, debris dispersion modeling, the team worked through all of it. And then someone asked the question, what if the mission fails? What if the missile malfunctions on launch? What if it re-enters the atmosphere? What if a nuclear weapon crashes uncontrolled into the lunar surface, or worse, back toward Earth, without detonating cleanly? The contamination risk alone was staggering, and there was another problem, a quieter one. Military planners concluded the American public wasn't prepared for a lunar nuclear demonstration of that scale. Leonard Rifle delivered his final report in 1959. The Air Force reviewed it, and then, very quietly, Project A119 was shelved. The program was classified, the documents were archived. Leonard Rifle didn't speak publicly about it for almost 40 years. But the Air Force wasn't done with the moon, because while A119 was being shelved, a parallel program was already underway. This one was even more ambitious, and it had a different goal entirely, not a demonstration, an occupation. The program was called Project Horizon, and it was the United States Army's formal proposal to establish a military base on the moon by 1966. The proposal ran to over 200 pages. It included detailed plans for transporting 245 Saturn rockets worth of equipment to the lunar surface. 12 soldiers would form the initial garrison. The base would be buried under lunar soil for protection against radiation and meteorite impact. The Army calculated the cost at $6 billion in 1959 dollars. The base would serve as a surveillance platform, a communications relay station, and if necessary, a weapons platform capable of targeting any point on Earth. General Arthur Trudeau, the Army's Chief of Research and Development, personally championed the proposal. He believed with absolute conviction that whoever controlled the moon controlled the Earth. He was not wrong about the strategic logic. He was, however, wrong about one thing. He assumed the Army would be the service that got to do it, and that's when Washington got involved. The fight over who owned America's space program had been brewing since Sputnik. The Army had Werner von Braun and the rocket team at Redstone Arsenal. The Air Force had its own ballistic missile program. The Navy had Vanguard. Everyone wanted a piece. In 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was created specifically to cut through the chaos. NASA would handle civilian space exploration. The military's role would be managed. Project Horizon died in committee, not because it was technically impossible, not because it was strategically unsound. It died because the political and diplomatic costs of publicly declaring a military installation on the moon were judged too high for any administration to absorb. The optics were, to put it mildly, a problem, but the military hadn't given up. Strategic priorities had simply shifted, and the programs that followed operated with greater institutional discipline. What came next reflected a different kind of ambition, capabilities built into carefully structured architecture, strategic intentions shaped by geopolitical reality. The Air Force's answer to Project Horizon was a program called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. Announced publicly in 1965, the MOL was presented as a military space station designed for reconnaissance. Astronauts would live aboard for 30 days at a time, using a powerful camera system to photograph Soviet military installations with unprecedented resolution. What declassified documents later revealed was the range of additional capabilities being studied for the platform: electronic intelligence collection, communications interception, and according to researchers who have analyzed the released record, foundational work towards space-based strategic systems. The MOL was canceled in 1969. The official reason: cost overruns and the emergence of unmanned reconnaissance satellites that could do the job more cheaply. The program had spent $1.5 billion. The 7 astronauts who had been training for it were transferred to NASA. Most said very little about the program publicly for years. The classification held. The funny part, if any of this can be called funny, is that the Soviets were doing exactly the same thing. The Soviet military had its own lunar strategic ambitions. Their classified program, known by Western analysts as the L3 and later expanded studies, included serious work on nuclear-armed lunar installations. Soviet military planners openly discussed the strategic value of the moon as a bombardment platform. From lunar orbit, a nuclear warhead could strike any target on Earth with almost no warning time. The problem was the same on both sides. The physics worked. The engineering was achievable. The cost was enormous but not prohibitive for a superpower at the height of the Cold War. The problem was the Outer Space Treaty. Signed on January 27, 1967, by the United States, the Soviet Union, and 105 other nations. The treaty explicitly prohibited the placement of nuclear weapons in space, on the moon, or on any other celestial body. Both superpowers signed it. Both superpowers had classified programs in various stages of development at the time. Both of them signed it anyway. And here is where the story becomes something more than Cold War history. Because the Outer Space Treaty prohibited nuclear weapons in space, it did not prohibit conventional weapons, it did not prohibit military operations, it did not prohibit the use of space for military purposes as long as those purposes were described as peaceful. The gap between what the treaty banned and what it permitted was significant. Strategic planners on both sides understood it immediately. The United States Air Force Space Command was formally established in 1982. Its mandate included the protection of American satellite assets and the development of capabilities to deny those assets to adversaries. The language was precise. The strategic intent was not ambiguous. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, immediately nicknamed Star Wars by critics. The proposal: a space-based missile defense system capable of intercepting Soviet ICBMs in flight. Whether SDI was ever technically feasible remains actively debated by defense analysts. What is not debated is that it permanently changed how both superpowers thought about space as a military domain. The moon warfare plans of 1958 had evolved into something more sophisticated, less dramatic, but in some ways far more consequential. The United States Space Force was established on December 20th, 2019, the first new military branch in 72 years. Its budget in fiscal year 2024, approximately $30 billion. Its mission includes protecting American satellites, developing counterspace capabilities, and maintaining what the official doctrine calls space superiority. That phrase, space superiority, is the direct intellectual descendant of what General Trudeau was, arguing in 1959 when he said that whoever controlled the moon controlled the Earth. The geography has shifted, the logic is identical. And the moon? The moon has returned to strategic focus in ways that would have seemed entirely familiar to the planners behind Project Horizon. NASA's Artemis program, developed alongside military research priorities, aims to establish a permanent human presence near the lunar South Pole. The stated reasons are scientific. The strategic dimensions, communications infrastructure, resource positioning, long-range operational reach, are being discussed openly in defense policy circles in a way they weren't a decade ago. China landed a rover on the far side of the moon in January 2019, the first nation ever to do so. Their lunar program is accelerating. Why? The boundary between their military and civilian space programs remains, according to most Western analysts, deliberately unclear. The competition that the architects of Project A119 were trying to prevent, a race for the ultimate high ground, did not end with the Cold War. It simply entered a different phase. Leonard Reifel finally told his story publicly in 2000. He was 74 years old. He described Project A119 not with pride, but with a kind of stunned reflection on what had been seriously proposed. a nuclear weapon, on the moon, as a morale demonstration. Declassified records indicate the program was halted primarily over safety concerns and the potential political fallout of a failed or incomplete mission, not for any single dramatic reason. Everything else, the Outer Space Treaty, the MOL, SDI, the Space Force, Artemis, all of it flows downstream from that original impulse. The recognition that space was not a frontier to be explored. It was terrain to be controlled. They built plans for the end of the world. Then they built plans for the moon. Then they built the infrastructure to make both of those things possible and shaped it around the strategic realities of each era. The strategic ambition never really went away. It just learned to speak a different language. If you made it this far, you already know this story goes deeper than one video can cover. Drop your questions in the comments. I want to know what you think is actually driving the new lunar race and what you make of the Space Force's expanding mission. If this is the kind of documented military history you want more of, subscribe. Like this video if it changed what you thought you knew. And I'll see you in the next one.